Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome to another installment in the series that I struggle to come up with a good name for, so I'm just going to call it, Is This Book As Bad As I Remember It? I previously looked at books like the Sonic's Handbook for 3.0, as well as Libris Mortis, the Book of the Dead for 3.5, and today we're taking a look at a pretty notorious book, at least as far as I'm concerned, as we take a look at the Miniatures Handbook. This came out in October of 2003, shortly after the release of the D&D Miniatures game, a plastic pre-painted randomized booster-based miniatures game where your character factions were based solely on their alignments, and if you wanted to create a theme for your warband, it was up to you to do that on your own. It was a tabletop skirmish game, very similar to the Chainmail Miniatures game, which was a much better minis game, in my opinion, but did not have the longevity that the plastic minis were able to enjoy. So when this book was first announced, I was excited because I wanted a good comprehensive rulebook for the miniatures game. We were really into the minis game at this point in time, and we were playing it pretty strictly based off of the actual miniatures rules, so using the blank grids with the tile cards, which were also gridded off, counting our squares and doing all that stuff. And this book was going to be a great supplement to go along with that, or at least so we thought. But this ended up being one of my all-time most biggest regrets when it comes to buying or purchasing an RPG book. So today I want to flip through it, being 19 years later, and really asking myself, is the book as bad as I remember it, or was I just kind of peeved because it wasn't what I was hoping it was going to be? And to show how much our group that was playing D&D minis at the time did not like this book. Several of us owned it, but we ended up using the Chainmail Miniatures game rulebook instead, and we played the game more like Chainmail than D&D Mini, so we would use just an open tabletop with terrain pieces and using measuring tapes for distance instead of the grids and counting squares. But let's take a look at what we actually have here today, and like I said, I'll see if it's as bad as I remember it. So the first portion of this book is going to be taken up with stuff for the tabletop role-playing game instead of the miniatures game. So the first thing that you see when you open this book are their new options for character classes, prestige classes, spells, magic items for the role-playing game instead of the rules for the miniatures game. But let's take a look at the classes that we have in here. We have the Favored Soul, the Healer, the Marshal, and the War Mage. So the Favored Soul, long story short, they are the divine version of a sorcerer. So where the cleric has to prepare their spells ahead of time. Each spell that they memorize, if they have 2 first level spells, for example, they had to memorize both of those slots, and they were locked into them with the exception of their spontaneous spellcasting ability for either cure or cure or cause spells. But the Favored Soul was just all completely a spontaneous spellcaster. So they cast spells exactly the same way that a sorcerer did. So yeah, it was this was actually a pretty cool class, I have to say, and it was reprinted in the Complete Divine book that came out, I think in 2004, I think is when those books came out. So this class would be reprinted, and I actually completely forgot that this was one of the classes in this book, because when I saw it in Complete Divine, I was like, oh, that's actually a really cool class, and I have to give credit where credit is due. It was in this book before it was in that one. So a good class all around. Then you have the Healer. So the Healer is, well, it's a class that focuses on healing and removing negative effects from you. So they get the ability once per day to do things like remove paralysis, cure disease, remove fear effects or poison. They have the ability at higher levels to allow you to affect somebody as if they cast Regenerate on them. And at 20th level, they can actually bring someone back as if they cast True Resurrection, which is a pretty good ability to just be able to do. Yeah, so overall, this is not a bad class. They also get to add their Charisma modifier to their cure spells, their healing spells, healing magic that they use. But this is something that is better suited as an NPC class, because like I know there are people that like to play support characters, but honestly, I think most people, if they wanted to do that, they would simply play a cleric instead. Because I think, yeah, this one has a pretty limited spell list. So again, the fact that their entire spell list can be summarized in this is something that is more like what the Adept was in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's a really cool class, but it's best used as an NPC rather than an actual player character class. And I don't know anyone that actually played one as a player. So if you played one as a player, let me know. I don't remember, I don't think this class was reprinted in Complete Divine either. So again, just goes to show you, again, cool class, cool concept, best for creating NPCs. Then we have the Marshal, and the Marshal can do things like grant extra move actions, and then they have auras. They have minor auras, which give you some minor bonuses to like skill checks based off different attributes, and then they have major auras, which have smaller modifiers, because the minor ones add their charisma modifier to whatever it is. So if it's something that gives a bonus to anyone within 60 feet when they're doing like a strength check, for example, they would add their charisma modifier to the strength check. But for the major auras, they're things like giving them damage reduction, being able to give them a bonus on damage rolls or attack rolls, both melee and ranged, giving them an increase to their speed in addition to granting them extra move actions. So again, really, again, cool stuff. It's kind of an early version of the Warlord class from 4th edition, which became the Battle Master in 5th edition. And the Warlord's one of my favorite classes. So again, this is a really cool character concept, but again, is best suited for an NPC because all of their abilities are basically like these auras that they grant, and they can only know a certain number of them, so they can't just pick and choose between all of them. When they gain certain levels, they just gain certain, they can choose from like the list that they get here. But yeah, I mean, again, a cool concept, better suited for an NPC though. And then you've got the War Mage. So the War Mage is another fantastic class, reprinted in Complete Arcane. In my last two 3.5 campaigns that I ran, Shackle City and Age of Worms, the primary arcane spellcaster in both of those campaigns was a War Mage, even though, and they were played by two different players. But the War Mage is essentially a sorcerer that focuses on damage dealing spells. They have class features which allow them to actually wear light and then medium armor. They also have the ability to choose spells from the evocation spell list that don't appear on the War Mage spell list. They also have the ability to apply meta magic feats a certain number of times per day as a sudden, basically like a free action as they're casting the spell, rather than having to take a feat for the ability to prepare a meta magic feat on a spell for a sorcerer like they would normally have to do. I think it was a practice spellcaster or something like that. That a sorcerer would have to take. So a meta magic feat can do things like empower a spell, which lets it do 1.5 times what it would normally do for like damage or things like that. You had maximize, which would maximize the damage. So fireball, for example, all of the d6 would be considered to have rolled a 6. You can also do things like quicken spells or like widen them to increase their area of effect. So yeah, it's being able to do that on the fly without having to take up a specific spell slot ahead of time and then risk just not being able to use that spell if the situation doesn't present itself. Pretty cool class. They also get to add their intelligence modifier to any damage that they do with their spells. Now, if it was something like Magic Missile or other spells where they could split up, like if they had multiple like Scorching Rays, for example, or multiple Magic Missiles, you would have to choose which of the missiles or which of the rays, for example, would get the bonus to intelligence. But this is actually a pretty good class as well. So yeah, and then we get some prestige classes here. So the 4 core classes that we get, they're all actually pretty good. 2 of them are good for player characters and were used for player characters in campaigns that I ran, and then the other 2 were great for NPCs. I did make a healer NPC, but I don't know if we actually ever ended up using it. I think it was one that I made, and it's like, this is an option you guys could have as a hireling in your group. but they went with something else. So for prestige classes, you have the Bonded Summoner. So they basically get an elemental companion. They gain resistance to whatever energy the elemental represents. Then they can also do things like take on an elemental form themselves. It's okay. Again, there was a miniature there was a miniature in the game that was like the Bonded Summoner. So they just had, this, obviously to justify the mini. But actually, in the 2006 D&D Worldwide Game Day module that I have, the final enemy, I think, in that adventure it used the mini for the Bonded Summoner. I don't think it used the Prestige class, but it did use the mini for it. Then you get things like the Dragon Samurai, which I wasn't too keen into, or the Lion Falcon Monk, which again I wasn't too keen into. You have the Havoc Mage. They get Battle Cast, so they can take a full round action to attack and cast a spell. So yeah, I mean it's all right, I guess. I think they could only cast it to a certain level spell using it though. Skull Clan Hunter, Tactical Soldier, the War Hulk. The War Hulk, you had to be larger, and you didn't get any base attack bonus. Instead, every level you gained a +2 to strength. So you did eventually get like +10 to hit and +10 to damage with your character. Or if you were using a two-handed weapon, it'd be +15 to damage. It was cool, I guess. Again, this was something that was almost always used for NPCs. In fact, a certain DM that I played under who would visit the Sadistic DM website, he used this Prestige class at least once, and I remember he had it so cheesed out with other like feats and other class options and stuff that it was absolutely insane to go up against. The War Chief, I think this might have been reprinted from a 3.0 book because I remember seeing like the stat blocks for the Bugbear Chieftain printed in Dragon Magazine from the Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance game, and I want to say it had War Chief or something similar to that in its for like levels. So that might be a reprint or it might be something completely different. I could just be remembering it wrong. Then we get our Metamagic feats. So we do have the sudden Metamagic feats, which were printed, I guess, in here for the first time, but they would be later reprinted in the Complete Arcane book. So I do want to see, though, because you had the War Mage being able to cast spells in up to medium armor eventually. I don't know if they actually got... there was a feat, I think, in Complete Arcane which lets them use heavy armor, but I don't think they get that here. I don't think that feat is in this book. So anyway, you get feats. So it's a staple of 3rd edition 3.5. Swift action spells. So things like Featherfall, for example, would turn into a swift action, which you could use sort of as a reaction or a free action instead of it taking like your standard action during the round. And some new spells, and the spells are actually pretty good. Arc of Lightning was pretty good. The orb spells like Orb of Acid, Orb of Cold, Orb of Fire, those were all pretty good spells. Baleful Transposition, so that one was pretty cool. Benign Transposition. So Benign Transposition allows you to change places with a willing target. And then Baleful Transposition, I think you just switch with an enemy. So, but that's basically all that is. Fireburst, Swift as a swift action. So there were swift action versions of other spells, and they functioned the same except that they had a much shorter duration. So Haste, the swift version of Haste, only lasts for 1 round. You got Slashing Darkness. So Slashing Darkness is awesome. So it basically was a negative energy version of the Searing Light spell. And I actually use Slashing Darkness in 5th edition to this day. I just have it as a cantrip for evil clerics or evil divine characters. And it's the same as Sacred Flame, but it's just negative energy, necrotic energy instead of radiant energy. And some new abilities, some new magic items. And some new monsters for the role-playing game. You have the Abyssal Eviscerator, the Aspects. So the Archfiend set was on the horizon, I think, when this came out, or was like the set coming out after the set that was coming shortly after this book came out. And yeah, the Aspects were some of the minis. Like I actually have some of them. So I don't have the Aspect of Osmodius, But I do have the aspect of Bahamut. I have the aspect of Demogorgon, which looks different because like the long necks and skinny body. Nowadays, Demogorgon is like super jacked and he doesn't have neck at all. Like he just has the two heads coming out of his shoulders. But I do have the aspect of Demogorgon Mini as well. I have the aspect of Cord. I used to have the aspect of Hextor, but I traded it to a friend of mine for the aspect of Bane. Because Bane is my favorite Forgotten Realms deity, and Hextor is his favorite Greyhawk deity, so I think we just swapped. The aspect of Loth, I do have that mini as well. That's a great mini. The aspect of Mephistopheles, I do not have that one, nor do I have the aspect of Nerul, which was an awesome mini, but I don't own it. I do have two aspects of Orcus, or at least I used to. I may have given one of them away. And then you've got the aspect of Tiamat and the aspect of Vecna. I don't know if they actually made a mini for that or not. But a Bright Naga, Catfolk, because, of course, Cave Dinosaurs, Crucians, Cursed Spirits, the Equiseph. If you want to play a horse-based humanoid, you can. Chainmail had a skeletal Equiseph, so it was already established that they existed. The Gravehound and the Kurthik. The Mad Slasher, Magma Hurler, and Nothic. Nothic, there was a Nothic in the Lost Mine of Phandelver in the 5th edition starter set. Scaled Stalker, that's actually a really cool looking creature. I also like the Comet, the Spark Lasher, and the Stone Child. So I want to say, so it's an extraplanar creature, but I want to say that the Stone Child was the inspiration behind the Goliath. And then the Walking Wall. And then we get into stat cards. So these are the stat cards for the minis game. So 72 pages of stuff for the tabletop role-playing game. But here we're finally getting into the stuff you would need for the miniatures game. Although it does start with reading the role-playing stat side of the stat card. Which, okay. There you go. And then the miniature side, so the factions, their point cost, commander effects, special abilities, hit points, all that stuff. That's actually a really cool miniature. I never had that one. I do have the Gold Champion, but the Gold Champion is painted red. It was never painted gold. The mini that they would always show in the promotional pictures was always properly painted. But the actual mini is literally like looks like a half red dragon. I don't know why they did that. I do have the brass dragon though. It's one of my favorite dragon minis. The black dragon, the medium-sized black dragon, is my favorite mini from most of like all the dragon ones. But the brass dragon was another like close second. And then you get into just the actual rules for the miniatures game, like how to set up, how to activate creatures, movement. Diagonals and how they, every second diagonal costs 2 squares instead of 1. Difficult terrain. So this is the stuff that, these are the basic rules for the miniatures game. So pretty useful stuff to have there. You got the Blackguard, which was an ultra rare chase fig in the Harbinger set. Even though they claimed that there was only 3 levels of rarity, there were certain rares that were really commonly found, and there were certain rares that like one person out of the entire number of people that bought frequently from the game store or whatever pull. So I'm a little bitter because the Blackguard was one that I really wanted and never got. The Troll, and some cool stuff in here. Werewolf scenarios, so if you wanted to do some unique scenarios instead of just the standard skirmish stuff, cool stuff. All right, things to have. Some variety for your miniatures game. The skirmish campaign, so the Chainmail miniatures game had the Ghostwind campaign, which was its own separate book that released and was awesome. We were actually doing the Ghostwind campaign at my local game store for a while, but we had never ended up finishing it, which really sucked because my elf faction was, I think, 0-3. I never lost a game with them, but we also stopped doing it. Like, we never actually finished the campaign, which kind of sucked. But it was a lot of fun. And then some magic items to give your units for the campaign. The glossary, giving you definitions and special abilities. So yeah, again, something that would be pretty useful. The mass battle rules, so we never use these. So the mass battle rules, they were kind of annoying because like you would create these units, right? You have like the grids that you fill out for them, and you couldn't use something with a player character class name as an actual unit. Maybe as a commander, but if you had like just say a dwarf fighter, like just a generic dwarf fighter, although I don't think there were too many that actually fell into that category. But there were like some low-level things that like they didn't have names, like they weren't unique named characters. They just had a class name associated with them, so they couldn't be units. They could be like a commander or a lone creature, but you couldn't. It was just one of those things that it was a way of trying to justify having like a crap ton of commons, I guess. But we never used these rules. There were other miniatures games on the market at the time that were formation based, like the Warhammer miniatures stuff, like that was all like squad based. Chronopia was had like a new version that I think had just come out shortly before this, and that was a unit based sort of game. So this was like trying to like mimic those, but the game was just really not designed for it. It was really designed to be like small war bands and skirmishes rather than large tactical war games sort of stuff. But again, you know, you got the rules are there if you want to try them. What commanders can do, victory conditions, information on terrain, mass battle, glossary. So yeah, not bad, I guess. Just something, like I said, we just never used it. Lots of glossary stuff. Random dungeons. Although I think this is for the role-playing game because you got challenge ratings listed here. But random dungeon stuff is still kind of cool. So you'd use the terrain cards, which had like dungeon rooms. So you could use those to create your dungeon. And then you could take a stack of creature cards and draw them at random to inhabit the rooms of the dungeon. So, I mean, cool stuff. Here's the Mind Flayer. I have the Mind Flayer. Random dungeon campaigns. I think there was also something in here actually for solo play, but I may have missed that. Playing without a DM. Not necessarily solo play, but just like without a DM. And then you got some templates and sample terrain cards, and then their feedback card at the end. So that's the Miniatures Handbook, and I've got to be honest, I hated this book when it first came out. I even did a video years ago talking about like buyer's remorse and some of the books that I had really high hopes for and just absolutely like regretted buying. And this was, I want to say, if it wasn't number one on that list, it was, you know, it had to be like number two. So I never really had anything positive to say about this book, but you know what? Looking at it nearly 20 years later, it's honestly not that bad of a book. You know, the decision to have it be both a supplement for the tabletop RPG and the rule book for the plastic pre-painted skirmish-based miniatures game was an interesting decision that I don't think many of us really expected them to do, especially to dedicate, you know, it's not quite half of the book's page count, but it's still a pretty sizable amount of this book is dedicated to the tabletop role-playing game. So that turned us off quite a bit back then. And like several of us that were playing D&D miniatures regularly at my local game store owned this book, but we never used it. Instead, we actually stopped playing it like it was written for these rules here, and we started playing it more like chainmail with an open tabletop and using tape measures to determine like your movement and stuff like that, and just converting the number of squares to the number of inches, because I think they were still, I want to say it was still the same. I think they were given like, you know, a speed of like 6, which would just be 6 squares, which would just translate to 6 inches. So yeah, we definitely did not give this book much of a chance at the time, but looking at both portions separately without like, you know, the anticipation of using this actively for the miniatures game back in the day. The stuff that they give you for the tabletop RPG is okay. The classes are pretty good. The prestige classes are pretty hit and miss, but that's the way prestige classes were. The spells were all good. They would all be spells that would be used pretty regularly after the spell compendium released. So there's just a lot of really cool stuff in the book that was used in the tabletop RPG pretty frequently, even by groups that I ran for, but they just weren't taking it from this book. They were taking it from stuff that they were reprinted in later. So that's kind of the thing there. So good stuff that I guess wasn't really appreciated until they were reprinted later. But what's there for the role-playing is all pretty decent stuff overall. And for the miniatures rules, it's the miniatures rules which are useful, but the ability to do like the different scenarios that they present in here is actually something that I wish we would have actually given a chance to back in the day, but we just didn't. We moved on to like running it like chainmail instead. But yeah, it's overall, it's an okay book that just has its focus a little bit too divided. If it wanted to be like a book that was like RPG stuff from the miniatures game, then I guess that's fine. Or if it just wanted to be a miniatures rule book, then again, that would have been fine. But you have both, and I didn't appreciate it back in the day. But looking at it nowadays, I have to say, I don't regret buying this as much as I used to. Will this be the book that I reference if I wanted to use the classes or stuff from that's in here from, or in my 3.5 campaigns? Probably not. I'd probably still take them from Complete Arcane, Complete Divine, Complete Warrior, or the Spell Compendium. And I think later books that reference the classes that were reprinted, it refers to them based off the books they were reprinted in and not the Miniatures Handbook. So it was something that we were really harsh on at the time, and I carried that with me for nearly 20 years. But all these years later, all I can say is that it's got some cool stuff. I think the PDF is available on DM's Guild. I don't know if you can get the print on demand, but the PDF might be all right if you're getting into 3.5 and you want a few extra classes to use. And hey, if you might actually be able to use the miniatures rules in this book to use with the Icons of the Realm minis and actually try to turn them into some sort of minis game. There's like stuff in here for sort of like deriving stats for the miniatures game from the tabletop RPG. So you could sort of use that as a baseline if you really wanted to. I always thought that the Icons of the Realm should have had like skirmish rules and stat cards included in the boxes, because you're paying a lot of money for a small number of miniatures and literally nothing else. So yeah, again, a book that's better than I remember it. So is it as bad as I remember? No, it's actually pretty decent overall. It's just underwhelming, and it wasn't what I wanted it to be back in 2003. So take that for what you will. But let me know, did you guys pick up the Miniatures Handbook back in the day? Did you use it for the tabletop skirmish game, or did you actually use it at your table for the role-playing game? Let me know that in the comments below. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you all next time. Till then, take care.